What happens when a man loses everything he's ever worked for, not to bad luck, not to circumstance, but to the calculated cruelty of someone he trusted? What happens when kindness is repaid with betrayal, when loyalty is met with destruction, and when a gentle soul is pushed beyond its breaking point? My name is William, and I'm 53 years old. I've seen enough of life to know that sometimes the universe doesn't balance the scales on its own. Sometimes, you have to do it yourself. Before we dive into this story, and trust me, you're going to want to hear every single word, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is built on real stories, real emotions, and real lessons that can change how you see the world. And while you're at it, smash that like button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one don't come around every day. I want you to do something for me. In the comments below, tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Are you in New York? London? Tokyo? A small town somewhere in the middle of nowhere? I read every single comment, and I'll personally say hello to as many of you as I can. There's something beautiful about knowing that right now, at this very moment, people from all corners of the earth are sharing this experience together. Now, let me tell you about Marcus Chen, and how one man's quest for revenge became the most perfectly orchestrated masterpiece of justice I've ever witnessed. Marcus Chen was the kind of man who still believed in handshake deals in a world of contracts written in blood. At 42, he had built Chen and Associates from nothing, just him, a beat-up laptop, and an unwavering belief that if you treated people right, they'd treat you right back. His architectural firm specialized in something beautiful, affordable housing projects that didn't look like concrete boxes. Marcus had grown up poor, sleeping on a pull-out couch in a one-bedroom apartment with his mother and two sisters after his father left. He remembered staring at the water stains on the ceiling, promising himself that someday, he'd design homes where kids wouldn't have to be ashamed of where they lived. For 15 years, Marcus poured everything into his company. 16-hour days were normal. Sleeping in the office happened more often than he cared to admit. He missed family dinners, canceled vacations, and turned down dates because there was always one more project, one more family that needed a decent place to call home. But it was worth it. By 2018, Chen and Associates employed 47 people. They had offices in 3 cities and a reputation that attracted clients from across the state. Marcus had finally made it, or so he thought. That's when David Hartwell entered his life. David was everything Marcus wasn't. Where Marcus was humble, David was charismatic. Where Marcus dressed in off-the-rack suits, David wore custom Italian tailoring. Where Marcus drove a 5-year-old Honda, David pulled up in a different luxury car each week. They met at a charity gala, one of those black tie events where the city's elite gathered to write tax-deductible checks and pat themselves on the back. Marcus only attended because his biggest client had insisted, and he felt out of place from the moment he walked in. Marcus Chen. David had approached with the kind of smile that belonged in toothpaste commercials. I've been hearing incredible things about your work. David Hartwell, Hartwell Development Group. Marcus knew the name. Everyone in the construction business did. Hartwell Development was massive: shopping centers, office complexes, luxury condos. They were the kind of company Marcus had always dreamed of partnering with. I have a proposition that could change everything for both of us, David had said that night, his hand resting on Marcus's shoulder with practiced familiarity. How would you like to design the future of this city? Over the next month, David courted Marcus like a long-lost brother. Expensive dinners at restaurants Marcus couldn't pronounce the names of. Box seats at baseball games. Golf at country clubs where the membership fees cost more than most people's yearly salary. And David talked. Oh, how he talked. Marcus, you're thinking too small, he'd say, cutting into a $40 steak. Affordable housing is noble, sure, but think bigger. What if we could reshape entire neighborhoods? What if we could create communities that bring people together? Marcus found himself getting caught up in David's vision. Here was someone who seemed to share his passion for creating better living spaces, but with the resources to do it on a massive scale. The project David proposed was ambitious, a mixed-use development called Riverside Commons. Luxury condos, yes, but also affordable units, retail space for local businesses, parks, community centers. It would revitalize a rundown part of downtown while providing homes for people across the economic spectrum. "I need someone I can trust as my partner on this," David had said during their final dinner meeting. "Someone with your vision, your integrity. This isn't just business, Marcus. This is legacy." Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, hoped that maybe he could have the best of both worlds. Make money and make a difference. The contract David presented was everything they discussed and more. Riverside Commons would be a 50-50 partnership. Marcus would handle all design and architectural oversight. David would provide funding and manage construction. Profits would be split equally after expenses. But here's the thing about trust: once someone decides to exploit it, you're already halfway to destruction before you even know the game has started. Marcus signed without reading the fine print. It was the most expensive mistake of his life. For the first 6 months, everything seemed perfect. Marcus threw himself into the Riverside Commons project like his life depended on it, which, in many ways, it did. He had committed his entire firm to the partnership, turning down other projects to focus solely on David's vision. Working 18-hour days became the norm. Marcus mapped out every detail: the flow between buildings, the green spaces that would give families room to breathe, the community center where kids could go after school. He designed affordable units that had the same attention to detail as the luxury condos, because in Marcus's mind, everyone deserved to live somewhere beautiful. His team at Chen and Associates caught his enthusiasm. Sarah, his head designer, stayed late reviewing plans. Tom, his project coordinator, managed timeline after timeline without complaint. Even the interns worked weekends, energized by the scope of what they were building. "This is what we got into architecture for," Marcus told his team during one late-night session. "We're not just drawing buildings. We're designing lives." David, meanwhile, played his part perfectly. He showed up to every major meeting, praised Marcus's work in front of city officials, and made sure the local press knew that Riverside Commons was going to be an architectural marvel that proves luxury and affordability can coexist. But if Marcus had been paying closer attention, he might have noticed the small things. The way David's construction crews never quite seemed to follow the architectural specs exactly. The way certain materials orders came in slightly different from what Marcus had specified. The way David always had an explanation that sounded reasonable but never quite added up. "Don't worry about those discrepancies," David would say with that million-dollar smile. "Construction is about adaptation. The important thing is we're building something incredible." Marcus trusted him. Why wouldn't he? They were partners. 6 months into construction, Marcus got a call that changed everything. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday when Marcus's phone rang. Sarah, his head designer, was crying so hard he could barely understand her. "Marcus, you need to get to the office. Now." When Marcus arrived, he found Sarah standing in their main conference room, surrounded by boxes of documents and her laptop open to what looked like financial records. "I couldn't sleep," she said, wiping her eyes. "Something David said in today's meeting kept bothering me, about the materials budget. So I decided to cross-reference our architectural specs with the actual purchase orders." What Sarah had discovered would have impressed even the most skilled forensic accountant. For months, David had been systematically substituting cheaper materials and pocketing the difference. The luxury condos that were supposed to have hardwood floors. Laminate that looked like wood. The earthquake-resistant steel beams. Standard construction grade. The energy-efficient windows. Basic double pane that would barely meet code. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the affordable housing units. David had been cutting corners there too, but not just on materials. He had been quietly reducing the number of affordable units in the development, replacing them with more luxury condos. The community center Marcus had designed. Scrapped, turned into a private gym for condo owners. The public green space. Now a private courtyard. Marcus stared at the documents until his eyes burned. Every corner David had cut made him more money while leaving Marcus liable for the design failures. Every change moved the project further from Marcus's vision and closer to just another luxury development for the wealthy. How long? Marcus asked Sarah. I think it's been happening from the beginning. Marcus spent the rest of the night going through every document, every contract addendum, every change order. As the sun came up, the full scope of David's deception became clear. David hadn't just been cutting corners. He had been systematically transferring financial liability for cost overruns to Marcus's company while keeping the profits for himself. If anything went wrong, if the city discovered the substandard materials, if the buildings failed inspection, if residents experienced problems, Chen and Associates would be legally responsible. But David had been even more clever than that. Buried in the partnership contract, the contract Marcus had signed without reading carefully, were clauses that allowed David to make necessary construction modifications without Marcus's approval. Every corner he cut, every material he substituted, every change he made was technically legal according to the agreement Marcus had signed. Marcus had handed David the weapon to destroy him, and David had been using it for months. Marcus called David that morning, his hands shaking as he dialed. "We need to talk," he said when David answered. "Of course, partner. What's on your mind?" "I know what you've been doing." There was a long pause. When David spoke again, his voice had changed. The friendly warmth was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Marcus, construction is a complicated business. Sometimes adjustments need to be made. I suggest you focus on your architectural drawings and leave the business decisions to people who understand them. This isn't an adjustment, David. This is fraud." Another pause. Then David laughed, actually laughed. "Read your contract, Marcus. Everything I've done is perfectly legal. You signed away your right to question my construction decisions. The only fraud here would be you trying to back out of our agreement." That's when Marcus realized the terrible truth. He hadn't entered into a partnership. He had walked into a trap. And David had been planning it from the very first handshake. What happened next was like watching a perfectly orchestrated demolition in slow motion. David didn't just betray Marcus, he destroyed him with the precision of a master strategist who had planned every move months in advance. The first blow came 3 days after their confrontation. Marcus arrived at his office to find two men in expensive suits waiting in the lobby with briefcases and grim expressions. Marcus Chen. "I'm James Morrison from Morrison, Kale and Associates. We represent Hartwell Development Group. You're being served." The lawsuit was a work of art in its cruelty. David was suing Marcus for breach of contract, claiming that Marcus had willfully and maliciously interfered with construction processes, causing delays and cost overruns that have jeopardized the entire Riverside Commons project. But the real masterpiece was the damages being sought, $4.7 million in lost profits, plus punitive damages that could triple that amount. Marcus stared at the papers with numb disbelief. According to David's version of events, Marcus was a difficult partner who constantly changed specifications, demanded expensive modifications, and refused to work with the construction team. Every conversation they'd had about quality and materials was being twisted into evidence of Marcus being unreasonably demanding and commercially unrealistic. The same afternoon, Marcus got a call from his bank. The construction loan David had arranged, the one that was supposed to be shared between their companies, had been restructured. Marcus's firm was now liable for the entire amount, $2.8 million. How is that possible? Marcus asked the loan officer. According to the documentation we have, Chen and Associates requested to assume full financial responsibility for the project. Your signature is on all the paperwork. Marcus's signature. On documents he had never seen, let alone signed. But there it was, looking exactly like his handwriting on every page. That evening, Marcus sat in his empty office building. His employees had gone home hours ago, trying to understand how his life had unraveled so completely in a single day. He was being sued for nearly $5 million by someone who was simultaneously claiming that Marcus owed almost $3 million more in construction costs. His phone rang. David. Marcus, I hope you're not taking this personally. This is just business. If you'd been more reasonable, more willing to work within the system, none of this would have been necessary. You forged my signature, Marcus said quietly. That's a very serious accusation. I hope you have proof. Because if you're going to make claims like that without evidence, well, that might be grounds for another lawsuit. Defamation is expensive, Marcus. The line went dead, leaving Marcus alone with the sound of his own heartbeat and the growing realization that David had been planning this destruction for months. Maybe years. Over the next week, the attacks came from every direction with military precision. First, the city building department suddenly discovered irregularities in Chen and Associates' architectural plans for Riverside Commons. Plans that had been approved months earlier were now being questioned. Marcus was facing a formal investigation that could result in the suspension of his architectural license. Second, 3 of Marcus's biggest clients received anonymous letters claiming that Marcus was under investigation for fraud and professional misconduct. 2 canceled their contracts immediately. The third demanded an immediate audit of their project finances. Third, Marcus's business insurance company received a complaint claiming that Marcus had misrepresented his professional qualifications and project experience when applying for his professional liability policy. They began their own investigation, threatening to cancel his coverage retroactively. Fourth, the local newspaper received a tip about potential fraud in the Riverside Commons project. The story ran on the front page of the business section, local architect under investigation for project irregularities. Every attack was perfectly legal. Every accusation was just plausible enough to require investigation. Every complaint was filed by anonymous sources who seemed to have detailed inside knowledge of Marcus's business. Marcus's lawyer, a decent man named Robert Chen who'd handled Marcus's contracts for years, was honest about the situation. Marcus, I've never seen anything like this. It's like someone studied every possible way to destroy a business and then executed each strategy simultaneously. The coordination it's almost impressive, if it wasn't so malicious. Within 2 weeks, Marcus had lost 6 major clients. His insurance company had placed him on a high-risk designation, tripling his premiums. The city had suspended his ability to submit new project applications pending their investigation. And the local construction community, the network of contractors, suppliers, and other architects he'd worked with for 15 years, had begun treating him like he was radioactive. Sarah came to his office on a Friday afternoon, her resignation letter in her hand and tears in her eyes. Marcus, I can't, my husband says I need to think about my family. If this company goes under. Tom left the next Monday. Then Jennifer. Then Mike. Within a month, Chen and Associates had gone from 47 employees to just Marcus and 2 loyal staff members who couldn't afford to quit. The worst part wasn't the financial destruction. It wasn't even the professional humiliation. The worst part was the doubt that began creeping into Marcus's mind about everyone he'd ever trusted. Had Sarah really discovered David's fraud by accident, or had she been reporting to David all along? Had Robert, his lawyer, really been giving him the best advice, or had he been steering Marcus toward decisions that would benefit David? Had any of his relationships been real, or had his entire life been built on lies? Marcus started staying awake at night, replaying every conversation, every handshake, every smile, looking for signs of deception he had missed. He stopped eating regularly. He stopped answering his phone unless he absolutely had to. He stopped looking in mirrors because he couldn't stand seeing the face of someone who had been so completely, utterly fooled. 3 months after signing the partnership agreement with David, Marcus Chen, the man who had built a successful company from nothing, who had provided homes for thousands of families, who had believed that treating people right would result in being treated right, was bankrupt, unemployed, and facing the very real possibility of losing his professional license forever. David had won. Completely. Or so it seemed. There's a moment in every man's destruction where he has to choose who he's going to become. Marcus Chen reached that moment on a cold Tuesday morning in November, sitting in his empty office building, staring at an eviction notice. Chen and Associates was officially dead. The bank had foreclosed on the building. His remaining 2 employees had found other jobs. His professional liability insurance had been cancelled. The State Board of Architecture had scheduled a hearing that would almost certainly result in the permanent revocation of his license. Marcus owned nothing but his 10-year-old Honda, some furniture, and approximately $1,400 in his checking account. He sat there for hours that morning, thinking about his father. The man who had abandoned the family when Marcus was 12, leaving behind nothing but debt and broken promises. Marcus had spent his entire adult life proving he was nothing like his father. He kept his word. He honored his commitments. He took care of the people who depended on him. And where had it gotten him? At 3:17 that afternoon, he remembered the exact time because he was staring at the clock on his computer screen. Marcus made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. And he wasn't going to let David Hartwell destroy him without consequences. But he also wasn't going to do anything stupid. He wasn't going to confront David physically. He wasn't going to make threats or do anything that would land him in jail. If David wanted to play games with contracts and legal maneuvers, then Marcus would learn to play those games better than David ever could. Marcus spent that night making a list. Not a list of what he had lost, that would have taken hours, but a list of what he still had. He had 15 years of experience in architecture and project management. He had a detailed understanding of construction processes and building codes. He had connections throughout the industry, even if many of them were currently avoiding him. He had a clean criminal record and, despite everything, a reputation for honest work that went back decades. Most importantly, he had something David had never possessed, the ability to live with very little and be content. The next morning, Marcus walked into the public library and began the most intensive education of his life. He checked out every book they had on business law, real estate development, and corporate finance. He spent hours reading legal databases online, studying case law about partnership disputes and construction fraud. But more than that, he began researching David Hartwell himself. What Marcus discovered in those first weeks was fascinating. David had been in business for 12 years, and Riverside Commons wasn't his first questionable project. Marcus found a pattern of partnerships that had ended badly, of smaller contractors who had been left holding expensive bills, of investors who had somehow lost money on projects that appeared profitable. But David was careful. Very careful. He never broke laws in ways that could be easily prosecuted. He was expert at finding the gray areas, at structuring deals that were technically legal but practically devastating to his partners. Marcus also discovered something else: David was ambitious. Not just financially ambitious, but socially and politically ambitious. He was positioning himself to run for city council, then mayor, then perhaps state legislature. His entire business strategy seemed designed not just to make money, but to build the kind of reputation and connections that could support a political career. That gave Marcus his first glimmer of an idea. Over the next month, Marcus systematically reached out to every contractor, architect, and business owner who had ever worked with David. He didn't accuse David of anything. He simply asked questions. How was David to work with? Did projects finish on budget? Were there any unusual contract terms? Would you work with him again? The picture that emerged was damning. David had a pattern of squeezing contractors on payments, of finding creative ways to avoid paying full invoices, of structuring deals so that he captured most of the upside while others absorbed the risk. But everyone Marcus talked to had the same response. There wasn't anything we could do about it. Everything was legal. He's just really good at writing contracts that favor him. Marcus realized that David's greatest strength, his ability to manipulate legal agreements, was also his greatest vulnerability. David assumed that because his contracts were legally sound, he was untouchable. But legality and ethics weren't the same thing. And in a city where David was building a political reputation based on his integrity and community leadership, the gap between legal and ethical could be exploited. Marcus began keeping detailed records of every conversation, every document, every interaction he had uncovered in David's business history. He organized it chronologically, cross-referenced it by project and by the people involved, and began to see the larger pattern of David's business model. David wasn't just occasionally unethical. He was systematically unethical. His entire business was built on finding sophisticated ways to take advantage of people who trusted him. But Marcus still needed something more than just a pattern. He needed proof of something specific, something that would resonate with the public and the media in a way that would damage David's carefully cultivated reputation. While Marcus was conducting his investigation, his personal life continued its downward spiral. He lost his apartment and moved into a studio that was barely larger than his old office. He sold his furniture to pay for groceries. He took a job as a night security guard at a construction site. The irony wasn't lost on him, to earn enough money to keep his phone and internet service active. But every morning after his night shift, he went to the library and continued his research. Every weekend, he drove to different parts of the state to interview people who had worked with David. Every spare dollar went toward copying documents and filing Freedom of Information requests with various city and county agencies. Marcus's investigation was methodical, patient, and thorough. It took him 4 months to piece together the complete picture of David's business model. And when he finally understood it, really understood it, he smiled for the first time since that night Sarah had shown him the evidence of David's betrayal. David Hartwell was about to discover that the quiet, trusting architect he had destroyed was not the same man who was going to be his adversary. Marcus had learned something crucial during those months of research: revenge wasn't about anger. Revenge was about patience, preparation, and precision. It was about understanding your enemy better than they understood themselves, and then using that knowledge to dismantle them systematically. David had made one critical error in his destruction of Marcus. He had assumed that because Marcus was honest and trusting, he was also weak and naive. But there's a difference between choosing to trust people and being incapable of strategic thinking. David had awakened something in Marcus that had been dormant for years, his ability to think like the opponent in a chess match where the stakes were everything. The hunter was about to become the hunted. And Marcus Chen had all the time in the world. Marcus's transformation from victim to investigator didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual metamorphosis, like a man learning to see in the dark after months of blindness. Every day brought new discoveries about David's business practices, and every discovery added another piece to the puzzle Marcus was slowly assembling. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday morning in February. Marcus was at the library, going through his daily routine of checking online records, when he stumbled across something that made his heart race: a property deed transfer for a piece of land that David had purchased 6 months before their partnership began. The land was in the exact location where Riverside Commons was now being built. David had bought it for $400,000 through a shell company called Riverside Holdings LLC. But according to the project documents Marcus had been shown, David claimed he was paying $1.2 million for the property. Marcus stared at the screen, his mind racing. David hadn't just been cutting corners on construction materials. He had been inflating the basic costs of the project from the very beginning, pocketing the difference while making Marcus legally liable for cost overruns. But that was just the beginning. Once Marcus knew what to look for, he began finding more shell companies, more inflated expenses, more creative accounting that funneled money into David's pocket while increasing liability for his partners. Riverside Materials Supply, supposedly an independent contractor charging premium prices for construction materials, was owned by David through another shell company. The materials themselves were being purchased at standard wholesale prices and marked up by 40% before being sold to the Riverside Commons project. Hartwell Construction Management, the company handling day-to-day construction oversight, was charging $50,000 per month in project management fees to coordinate work that was actually being done by David's regular employees. Even the architectural review process had been corrupted. David was paying $25,000 to an independent architectural consultant to review and approve changes to Marcus's designs. The consultant was David's brother-in-law. Every single aspect of the Riverside Commons project had been designed to extract maximum profit for David while creating maximum liability for Marcus. The partnership hadn't been a business relationship, it had been an elaborate shell game designed to make David rich and Marcus bankrupt. But Marcus still needed more than just financial records. David was too smart to put obvious fraud in writing. What Marcus needed was evidence of intent, proof that David had deliberately set out to deceive his partner from the very beginning. That evidence came from an unexpected source, Linda Morrison, a secretary who had worked for David 3 years earlier. Marcus found Linda through his systematic process of interviewing former David employees. Most had been reluctant to talk, bound by non-disclosure agreements or simply afraid of David's reputation for retaliation. But Linda was different. She was retired, living comfortably on her pension, and she had no reason to fear David anymore. That man, she told Marcus over coffee at a small diner near her home, was the most manipulative person I ever worked for. And honey, I worked in corporate America for 35 years, so that's saying something. Linda had been David's executive assistant during his partnership with a contractor named Robert Kim on a shopping center project. The pattern, she told Marcus, was identical to what had happened with Riverside Commons. David would spend weeks researching potential partners, Linda explained. He didn't just look at their finances, he looked at their personalities, their family situations, their business relationships. He was looking for people who were successful but trusting, people who had strong reputations but weren't sophisticated about complex financial arrangements. But Linda had something even more valuable than insight into David's methods. She had kept copies of documents. I knew what he was doing wasn't right, she said, pulling out a manila folder. I couldn't prove it was illegal, but it wasn't right. So I kept copies of things, just in case someone ever needed them. The folder contained a treasure trove of information, emails between David and his lawyer discussing asset protection strategies for his partnerships, draft contracts with notes about how to maximize liability transfer, and most damning of all, a memo David had written to himself titled Partner Selection Criteria. Ideal partners should possess 1. Strong professional reputation that can be leveraged for project credibility, 2. Sufficient assets to absorb cost overruns and potential litigation, 3. Limited experience with complex development projects, 4. Personality traits that suggest tendency to trust rather than verify, 5. Personal or professional circumstances that make thorough contract review unlikely. Marcus stared at the document, seeing his own destruction laid out in David's handwriting like a recipe. He had been selected not despite his trustworthy nature, but because of it. His success, his reputation, his belief in treating people fairly, these weren't just character traits David had exploited. They were the very reasons David had chosen him as a victim. There's more, Linda said quietly. She showed Marcus email exchanges between David and his accountant discussing how to structure the partnership termination to maximize damage recovery while minimizing exposure. The emails were dated 2 weeks before David had ever approached Marcus at the charity gala. David hadn't just planned to betray Marcus. He had planned to destroy him before they had ever met. Marcus left his meeting with Linda with more than just documents. He left with absolute clarity about what David Hartwell really was, not just a dishonest businessman, but a predator who systematically identified and destroyed people for profit. Over the next 6 weeks, Marcus used Linda's documents as a roadmap to understand David's entire business model. He identified 4 other partnerships that had ended in litigation and financial ruin for David's partners. He found contractors who had been driven out of business by David's payment manipulation. He discovered a pattern of behavior that went back nearly a decade. But Marcus also understood something crucial: exposing David's business practices wouldn't be enough. David was too politically connected, too skilled at public relations. He would find a way to minimize the damage, blame his partners, and continue operating. Marcus needed something bigger. Something that would destroy not just David's business, but his entire carefully constructed public persona. That's when Marcus began investigating David's political ambitions. David had been cultivating relationships with city council members, county commissioners, and state legislators for years. He donated generously to their campaigns, hosted fundraising events, and positioned himself as a business leader who cares about community development. But Marcus discovered that David's political strategy was just as calculated and manipulative as his business practices. He was using his development projects to build political relationships, offering lucrative contracts to companies owned by politicians' family members, and structuring projects to benefit specific districts in ways that would help his political allies. Most importantly, Marcus found evidence that David was planning to announce his candidacy for city council in 6 months. His entire campaign would be built around his record as a successful developer who brings jobs and housing to working families. The campaign would feature Riverside Commons as the centerpiece of David's community leadership, the affordable housing project that proved David cared about more than just profit. Marcus realized that David's political ambitions weren't just a side interest. They were the entire point of his business model. David wasn't just trying to make money, he was trying to build the kind of public reputation that could support a career in politics. Every partnership he destroyed, every contractor he cheated, every corner he cut was acceptable collateral damage in service of his larger ambition. And that gave Marcus the perfect target for his revenge. David's political career depended on his public reputation as an ethical businessman and community leader. If that reputation was destroyed, not just damaged, but obliterated in a very public way, David would lose everything he had been working toward for more than a decade. Marcus spent the next month developing a plan that was as methodical and comprehensive as David's original destruction of Chen and Associates. But where David's plan had been designed to destroy one man, Marcus's plan was designed to destroy David's entire future. The architect who had once believed in handshake deals and trusting people was gone. In his place was a man who understood that sometimes justice required the same level of strategic thinking that had been used to create the injustice. Marcus Chen was about to teach David Hartwell that the most dangerous enemy is the one who has nothing left to lose and all the time in the world to plan their revenge. The plan Marcus developed wasn't born from anger, though anger had certainly played its part in motivating him. It was born from a deep understanding of David's psychology and an architect's attention to detail. Marcus had spent months learning how David thought, how he operated, what he valued most. Now he was going to use that knowledge to dismantle David's life with the same precision that David had used to destroy his. The plan had 3 phases, each designed to build on the previous one, creating a cascade of consequences that would be impossible for David to stop once it began. Phase 1 was about documentation and preparation. Marcus needed to create an unassailable record of David's business practices that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. But more than that, he needed to prepare the ground for maximum impact when the story eventually broke. Marcus had learned from his own destruction that timing was everything. David had coordinated multiple attacks simultaneously, making it impossible for Marcus to respond effectively to any single problem before the next one hit. Marcus was going to use the same strategy. The first person Marcus recruited to his cause was Jennifer Walsh, an investigative journalist who had covered business corruption for the city newspaper for 15 years. Marcus had read every article she'd ever written, studying her approach, understanding what kind of stories she found compelling. Jennifer was skeptical when Marcus first approached her. She'd heard about his legal problems with David, and she was naturally suspicious of what might look like a disgruntled partner trying to get revenge through the media. But Marcus was prepared for her skepticism. He didn't lead with accusations or emotional appeals. Instead, he presented her with a simple question: How many times has David Hartwell's partnerships ended in litigation against his former partners? When Jennifer did her own research, she found the same pattern Marcus had discovered. 4 partnerships in 10 years, all ending with David suing his former partners for breach of contract, all resulting in financial ruin for everyone except David. "This is either the unluckiest businessman in the state," Jennifer told Marcus during their 3rd meeting, "or there's a pattern here that deserves investigation." Marcus provided Jennifer with everything he had discovered: the shell companies, the inflated expenses, the documented strategy for selecting and destroying partners. But he also gave her something more valuable: access to Linda Morrison and the other former employees who were willing to talk. Phase 2 was about building a coalition. Marcus understood that one newspaper article, no matter how well researched, wouldn't be enough to destroy someone as politically connected as David. He needed multiple sources of pressure, multiple investigations happening simultaneously. Marcus reached out to Robert Kim, the contractor who had been David's victim 3 years earlier. Robert had lost his business and his marriage to the stress of David's litigation, but he had never stopped believing that someday David would face consequences for his actions. "I tried to warn people about him," Robert told Marcus. But who was going to believe a bankrupt contractor over a successful developer? Marcus also contacted the other former partners, the contractors who had been cheated, the employees who had been fired for asking inconvenient questions. One by one, he convinced them to speak with Jennifer, to share their documents, to add their voices to the growing record of David's systematic misconduct. But Marcus's most important recruitment was Sarah Chen, his former head designer who had first discovered David's material substitutions. Sarah had been living with guilt for months, knowing that her resignation had contributed to the collapse of the company she had loved working for. When Marcus approached her, she was eager to help, but she was also terrified of David's reputation for retaliation. "What if he sues me too?" she asked Marcus. "I can't afford the legal fees. I can't risk losing another job." Marcus had an answer for that concern. Through his months of research, he had identified something that David didn't know Marcus knew. David's entire business model was built on leveraging fear of litigation, but David couldn't actually afford to file frivolous lawsuits against too many people simultaneously. His legal costs were already substantial from his ongoing cases, and his cash flow wasn't as strong as he pretended. "He can't sue all of us," Marcus told Sarah. "His power comes from people being afraid to speak up. But if enough people speak up at the same time, he won't be able to intimidate everyone." Sarah agreed to provide testimony and documents to Jennifer's investigation. So did Robert Kim. So did Linda Morrison. So did 6 other people who had been damaged by David's business practices. Phase 3 was about timing and coordination. Marcus had learned that David planned to announce his city council candidacy at a major fundraising event in 3 months, an event that would be covered by all the local media and attended by every important political figure in the city. Marcus planned to destroy David's reputation exactly 1 week before that announcement. But the newspaper investigation was just the beginning. Marcus had also been working with the State Board of Architecture to file a formal complaint about the misrepresentation of architectural plans on the Riverside Commons project. He had contacted the city building department with evidence of code violations. He had reached out to the state attorney general's office about potential consumer fraud in David's real estate practices. Each investigation would be triggered by the newspaper article, creating a cascade of official inquiries that would make it impossible for David to dismiss the charges as merely disgruntled former partner trying to get revenge. But Marcus had one more element to his plan, something that would ensure David couldn't use his political connections to minimize the damage. Marcus had spent weeks researching the political donors and business partners who had supported David's rise. Many of them were people who genuinely believed David was an ethical businessman. They had been as deceived as Marcus himself had been. When they learned the truth about David's business practices, they would have their own reasons to distance themselves from him. 2 weeks before the plan was set to launch, Marcus did something he hadn't done since the night Sarah had shown him evidence of David's betrayal. He allowed himself to feel hope. Not hope that he would recover his business, Marcus understood that Chen and Associates was gone forever. Not hope that he would recover his money, most of that was gone too. But hope that David Hartwell would finally face consequences for the systematic destruction of people who had trusted him. Marcus had spent 8 months learning to think like David, to plan like David, to anticipate David's responses and counter them before they could be implemented. But there was one crucial difference between Marcus's plan and David's business model. David destroyed people for profit and personal advancement. Marcus was seeking justice for himself and for everyone else David had harmed. That difference would prove to be David's undoing. The week before the plan launched, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. It was David, calling from what sounded like his car. "Marcus, I've been hearing some concerning rumors. People saying you've been asking questions about my business practices, talking to reporters. I hope you understand that making false accusations could be very expensive for you." Marcus had been prepared for this call. He had practiced his response. "I'm not making accusations, David. I'm just sharing facts with people who are interested in them. Facts can be misinterpreted, Marcus. Context matters. I'd hate to see you make things worse for yourself by spreading information that might be taken the wrong way. I appreciate your concern. But I'm confident that anyone who looks at the complete picture will draw their own appropriate conclusions." There was a long pause. "Marcus, I gave you a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself. You chose to be difficult instead of cooperative. But it's not too late to reconsider. Drop whatever you think you're doing, and maybe we can find a way to resolve our differences. Our differences were resolved months ago, David. You got what you wanted. Now I'm going to get what I want." "And what is that, exactly?" Marcus smiled, even though David couldn't see it. "Justice." David hung up without another word. Marcus sat in his small apartment, looking out at the city where he had built his career and lost everything, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months, absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing. In 3 days, Jennifer Walsh's investigation would be published. The story would run on the front page of the Sunday paper, the edition with the highest readership. By Monday morning, every person David had ever done business with would know the truth about his systematic exploitation of his partners. The state investigations would begin on Tuesday. The political donors would start distancing themselves by Wednesday. The fundraising event David had planned would be cancelled by Thursday. And David Hartwell, the man who had destroyed Marcus's life for profit and political advancement, would discover what it felt like to lose everything he had worked for. Marcus had learned something important during his months of planning: revenge wasn't about anger or hatred. Revenge was about balance. David had used Marcus's trust and decency against him. Now Marcus was going to use David's arrogance and greed against him. The student was about to become the teacher. Sunday morning, March 15th, Marcus woke up at 5:30 a.m., not because he had set an alarm, but because he had been too excited to sleep. After 8 months of planning, research, and preparation, the day had finally arrived. Jennifer Walsh's investigation would be published in 2 hours. Marcus drove to a coffee shop near the newspaper's distribution center and bought the first copy off the truck. The headline was perfect: "Successful Developers' Pattern of Failed Partnerships Raises Questions About Business Practices." The article was devastating in its thoroughness. Jennifer had done exactly what Marcus had hoped. She had presented the facts objectively, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions about David's business model. The story included interviews with 4 former partners, documentation of the shell companies and inflated expenses, and analysis of the legal strategies David used to destroy his business relationships. But the most damaging part was a sidebar article titled, "The Human Cost of Business Disputes." It featured brief profiles of the people whose lives had been destroyed by their partnerships with David: Robert Kim, who had lost his construction business and his marriage; Sandra Martinez, an interior designer who had been forced to declare bankruptcy; Thomas Wright, a project manager who had been blacklisted from the industry after David sued him for alleged incompetence; and Marcus Chen, whose architectural firm had been destroyed just as he was achieving his dream of creating affordable housing that didn't look like concrete boxes. Marcus read the article 3 times, checking every detail, every quote, every source citation. It was flawless. Jennifer had presented an unassailable case that David Hartwell was not the ethical businessman he pretended to be, but a predator who systematically identified and destroyed trusting partners for profit. By 10 a.m., Marcus's phone was ringing. First it was Robert Kim, calling to thank Marcus for finally bringing David's business practices to light. Then Sandra Martinez. Then 2 contractors who had worked on David's projects and had always suspected something wasn't right about his operation. But the most important call came at 11:15 a.m. It was Jennifer Walsh. "Marcus, you need to know what's happening. My editor has been getting calls all morning from people who read the story and want to share their own experiences with David Hartwell. We're talking about people who weren't in the original article, suppliers who weren't paid, subcontractors who were forced to work for below-market rates, even some of David's political supporters who are saying they never knew about his business practices." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. This was exactly what he had hoped for. The article was creating momentum that would be impossible for David to stop. "But Marcus, there's something else. David's lawyer has already called my editor threatening a defamation lawsuit. They're claiming that the article is based on fabricated documents and testimony from disgruntled former partners with axes to grind." Marcus had expected this response. David's first instinct would be to use legal intimidation to silence his critics. But Marcus had prepared for this too. "Jennifer, remember what we discussed about David's litigation strategy. He threatens lawsuits he can't afford to file. And even if he does sue, Discovery would give you access to all of his business records. David's worst nightmare is having his financial practices examined under oath in a public court proceeding." Marcus was right. By Monday morning, it was clear that David's legal threats were empty bluster. Not only did the newspaper stand behind the story, but David's threat to sue had been covered as a separate news item, drawing even more attention to the original investigation. More importantly, the cascade of consequences Marcus had planned was beginning. Monday afternoon, the State Board of Architecture announced they were opening a formal investigation into allegations that David Hartwell had misrepresented architectural plans and specifications on multiple projects. The investigation would include a public hearing where David would be required to testify under oath about his business practices. Tuesday morning, the City Building Department announced they were conducting a comprehensive review of all David's current and recent projects, looking for code violations and permit irregularities. 3 construction sites were immediately shut down pending inspection. Tuesday afternoon, the State Attorney General's office confirmed they were reviewing complaints about David's real estate and development practices to determine if consumer protection laws had been violated. But the real damage was happening in David's political and business networks. By Wednesday, 5 major donors had withdrawn their support for David's planned city council campaign. The fundraising event that was supposed to launch his political career had been cancelled. 2 current city council members had publicly stated they would not be endorsing David's candidacy. The local construction industry, which had tolerated David's practices because he was successful and politically connected, suddenly found their backbone. The Regional Contractors Association announced they were reviewing David's membership. 3 major suppliers put his accounts on credit hold pending resolution of the various investigations. But Marcus's favorite consequence was completely unexpected. David's insurance company announced they were reviewing his professional liability coverage. If they found evidence of systematic misrepresentation or fraud, they could cancel his policies and refuse to cover claims related to his past projects. Without insurance, David couldn't bid on new projects. Without new projects, he couldn't generate the cash flow needed to service his existing debts. Without cash flow, his entire business empire would collapse. On Thursday evening, Marcus's phone rang. It was David. "Marcus, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Some of the information in that newspaper article was taken out of context. I'd like to sit down with you and clarify a few things." Marcus had been waiting for this call. David was finally beginning to understand the scope of what was happening to him. "I'm not sure there's anything to clarify, David. The facts speak for themselves. The facts can be interpreted different ways. I've always operated within the law, Marcus. You know that. Sometimes business relationships don't work out the way everyone hopes, but that doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong. David, do you remember what you told me the day I discovered what you were doing? You said construction is a complicated business, and that I should focus on architectural drawings and leave business decisions to people who understand them. I remember that conversation differently. I'm sure you do. But I learned something important from our partnership. I learned that understanding the business is just as important as understanding the architecture. So I spent some time learning about your business model." There was a long pause. "Marcus, I know you're angry. You have every right to be angry. But destroying my reputation won't bring back your company. It won't solve your financial problems. What if we could find a way to make things right between us?" Marcus almost laughed. Even now, facing the collapse of everything he had built, David was trying to negotiate, trying to find an angle that would allow him to escape consequences. "David, the time for making things right was 8 months ago, when I trusted you enough to sign a partnership agreement without reading the fine print. The time for making things right was when I discovered your material substitutions and gave you a chance to explain. The time for making things right was when you could have structured our partnership fairly instead of designing it to destroy me. Marcus. I'm not interested in making things right between us, David. I'm interested in making sure that what you did to me, and to Robert Kim, and to Sandra Martinez, and to all the other people whose lives you've destroyed for profit, I'm interested in making sure that doesn't happen to anyone else. You think you've won something, Marcus? You think destroying my reputation makes you a winner? You're still bankrupt. You're still facing professional sanctions. You're still the architect who trusted the wrong person and lost everything." Marcus smiled, even though David couldn't see it. "You're right, David. I did lose everything. But there's something you never understood about me. I didn't build my company to get rich. I built it to create something meaningful. And you can't destroy the meaning of what I did by taking away the business." That's very philosophical, Marcus. Philosophy doesn't pay rent. No, it doesn't. But it does help you sleep at night, which is something I suspect you're going to have trouble with for the foreseeable future. Marcus hung up and sat in his small apartment, looking out at the city lights. David was right about one thing: Marcus was still bankrupt, still facing professional sanctions, still dealing with the financial consequences of trusting the wrong person. But David was wrong about everything else. Marcus had won something far more valuable than money or professional success. He had won the knowledge that David Hartwell would never again be able to systematically destroy trusting people for profit and personal advancement. More than that, Marcus had discovered something about himself that he hadn't known existed. For 42 years, he had believed that his greatest strengths were his honesty, his trusting nature, and his belief in treating people fairly. David had shown him that those same qualities could be weaponized against him by someone ruthless enough to exploit them. But over the past 8 months, Marcus had learned that he possessed something else: the ability to think strategically, to plan comprehensively, and to execute those plans with the same precision that David used in his business practices. Marcus had always been an architect. But David had forced him to become something more: an architect of justice. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Jennifer's article had been published, Marcus woke up to news that exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. David Hartwell's construction company had filed for bankruptcy protection. The cascade of investigations, cancelled contracts, and withdrawn support had created a cash flow crisis that David couldn't survive. Within days, he would be forced to lay off his entire staff and close his offices. But more importantly, 3 more people had come forward with evidence of David's systematic fraud. The state attorney general had announced that David was now the subject of a criminal investigation, not just administrative inquiries. David Hartwell, the man who had destroyed Marcus's life for profit and political advancement, was about to discover what it felt like to face criminal prosecution for his business practices. Justice, Marcus realized, was a dish that was indeed best served cold. But sometimes, if you planned carefully enough and waited long enough, it could be served with a side of poetic perfection. In the weeks that followed David's business collapse, Marcus watched the dominoes continue to fall with the fascination of an architect studying a perfectly executed controlled demolition. Each consequence led inevitably to the next, creating a cascade of destruction that was as comprehensive as it was irreversible. The criminal investigation moved faster than anyone had expected. The state attorney general's office, energized by the media attention and the clear pattern of fraudulent behavior, assigned their most experienced prosecutor to the case. Within a month, David was facing 18 felony counts related to fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. But the criminal charges were just the beginning of David's problems. His bankruptcy filing had triggered a comprehensive audit of his business practices going back 5 years. Forensic accountants discovered financial irregularities that made Marcus's research look elementary by comparison. David had been running what was essentially a Ponzi scheme, using money from new projects to pay outstanding debts from previous partnerships, all while maintaining the illusion of profitability through creative accounting and shell company transactions. The investors who had trusted David with their money began filing their own lawsuits. The contractors who had been cheated on payments joined class action suits seeking damages. The insurance companies who had covered his projects began investigating whether they could void their policies based on misrepresentation and fraud. Within 2 months, David was facing more than $40 million in civil liability, in addition to the potential prison time from his criminal charges. Marcus followed these developments with the attention to detail that had made him a successful architect. He read every court filing, every news article, every financial disclosure. Not because he was gloating, though he would have been lying if he claimed there wasn't some satisfaction in watching David face consequences for his actions, but because he was learning. Marcus was learning about the full scope of David's systematic fraud, understanding how many people had been victimized over the years, and beginning to grasp the true extent of the damage that one ruthlessly calculating person could inflict on a community. But Marcus was also learning something about the nature of justice itself. David's destruction was more complete than Marcus had ever imagined possible when he began his investigation. David hadn't just lost his business and his political aspirations, he had lost his reputation, his freedom, and his entire future. Yet Marcus found himself feeling something he hadn't expected, a kind of hollow sadness about the completeness of David's fall. Marcus had spent so many months focused on exposing David's crimes that he had never really considered what David's life would look like after the exposure. David had been a husband, a father, a member of the community who, despite his systematic cruelty in business, had probably convinced himself that he was a good person who was just playing the game according to his own rules. Now David's wife had filed for divorce, seeking to protect whatever assets she could from the civil judgments. His children, who were in high school and college, were dealing with the public humiliation of having their father exposed as a criminal. His friends and social connections had evaporated as quickly as his business relationships. Marcus realized that revenge, even perfectly executed revenge, was a more complex emotion than he had anticipated. He felt satisfied that David could no longer harm other people, pleased that his own destruction had been avenged, and grateful that the other victims of David's schemes would finally have the opportunity for legal recourse. But he also felt something like pity for the man whose life he had systematically dismantled. That pity disappeared completely when Marcus received a phone call from Jennifer Walsh in early May. "Marcus, I need to tell you about something that's come up in the criminal investigation. The prosecutor's office has been going through David's personal records, and they found something that I think you should know about." What Jennifer told Marcus eliminated any remaining sympathy he might have felt for David Hartwell. David had been keeping detailed files on all of his business partners, not just their financial information and business practices, but personal information that could be used against them. The files included credit reports, family financial situations, personal relationships, even medical records obtained through private investigators. David hadn't just selected his partners based on their business vulnerabilities. He had researched their personal lives to identify psychological and emotional pressure points that could be exploited if the partnership needed to be terminated aggressively. Marcus's file was particularly detailed. David had known about Marcus's father abandoning the family, about Marcus's tendency to work too hard and neglect personal relationships, about his deep-seated need to prove himself as reliable and trustworthy. David had even known about Marcus's modest personal finances and his habit of reinvesting profits back into the business rather than building personal wealth. David had selected Marcus not just because he was successful and trusting, but because his personal psychology made him particularly vulnerable to the specific type of manipulation David specialized in. "Marcus," Jennifer said quietly, "David didn't just plan to betray you. He planned to destroy you psychologically as well as financially. There are notes in your file about your pathological need to be perceived as reliable, and how that could be used to maximize your emotional distress during the partnership termination." Marcus sat in his apartment, listening to Jennifer describe the contents of David's files, and felt something he hadn't experienced since the early days of his investigation: pure, undiluted anger. David hadn't just been a dishonest businessman. He had been a predator who studied his victims like specimens, identifying their deepest insecurities and strongest values, then systematically using that knowledge to inflict maximum psychological damage. Any remaining questions Marcus had about the morality of his revenge evaporated in that moment. David Hartwell deserved everything that was happening to him, and more. The criminal trial began in September, almost exactly 1 year after Marcus had signed the partnership agreement that had destroyed his life. Marcus attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching David face the consequences of his systematic cruelty. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had financial records, testimony from victims, evidence of the shell companies and fraudulent invoices, and most damaging of all, David's own files documenting his strategy for manipulating and destroying his business partners. David's defense attorney tried to argue that his client was guilty of nothing more than aggressive business practices in a competitive industry. He claimed that the partnership agreements were legal contracts that all parties had signed willingly, and that David couldn't be held responsible if his partners hadn't read the fine print carefully enough. But the prosecutor, a sharp woman named Catherine Morrison who had built her career prosecuting white-collar crime, systematically dismantled David's defense. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said during her closing argument, "the defense wants you to believe that Mr. Hartwell was simply a successful businessman who was smarter than his partners. But the evidence shows us something very different. The evidence shows us a man who systematically targeted victims, researched their vulnerabilities, and then exploited those vulnerabilities to steal millions of dollars while destroying the lives and livelihoods of people who trusted him." She paused, looking directly at David. This wasn't business. This was predation. And predators, regardless of how expensive their suits are or how articulate their explanations, must face consequences for their actions. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found David Hartwell guilty on all 18 felony counts. Marcus was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. He watched David's face as each guilty verdict was announced, seeing the man who had systematically destroyed his life finally face accountability for his actions. But the moment that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life came during the victim impact statements phase of the sentencing hearing. Marcus had been asked to speak, along with Robert Kim, Sandra Martinez, and 8 other people whose lives David had destroyed. Marcus had spent weeks preparing his statement, trying to find words that could adequately express the impact of David's betrayal. But when his turn came to speak, he found himself setting aside his prepared remarks and speaking from the heart. "Your Honor, David Hartwell didn't just steal money from me. He stole something much more valuable, my ability to trust people. For 15 years, I built my business on the belief that if you treat people fairly, they'll treat you fairly in return." David proved that belief was naive, and for a long time, that left me wondering if there was any point in trying to be an honest person in a world full of people like him. Marcus paused, looking directly at David. But over the past year, I've learned something important. David's cruelty didn't prove that honest people are fools. It proved that honest people need to be smarter about identifying dishonest people. And more than that, it proved that sometimes honest people need to fight back, not with dishonesty, but with persistence and careful planning and an absolute refusal to let predators escape consequences for their actions. David, you taught me something valuable, though I'm sure it wasn't what you intended. You taught me that justice sometimes requires the same level of strategic thinking and long-term planning that you use to destroy people. You taught me that good people sometimes have to be just as methodical and unrelenting as bad people, not to become like them, but to stop them. Marcus looked back at the judge. I'm not asking for revenge, Your Honor. I'm asking for consequences that are proportionate to the systematic nature of Mr. Hartwell's crimes. He didn't destroy people's lives impulsively or accidentally. He did it methodically, with careful planning and detailed preparation. His punishment should reflect that same level of intention and completeness. The judge sentenced David Hartwell to 12 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole before serving at least 8 years. The civil judgments against him would ensure that even after his release, he would spend the rest of his life paying restitution to his victims. Marcus walked out of the courthouse that day feeling something he hadn't experienced since the morning Sarah had shown him evidence of David's betrayal, a sense of completion. The story could have ended there, with David in prison and Marcus vindicated. But life, Marcus was learning, rarely provides the clean endings that stories demand. Marcus still faced the practical reality that his career as an architect was over. The State Board of Architecture had cleared him of professional misconduct, but his reputation in the construction industry remained tainted by association with the scandal. Few clients wanted to work with someone who had been involved in such public legal drama, even as a victim. Marcus had also spent most of his remaining savings on legal fees and investigation costs. He was 43 years old, professionally unemployed, and financially exhausted. But Marcus discovered that his systematic destruction of David Hartwell had taught him skills that were surprisingly transferable. His months of investigation had given him experience in financial analysis, legal research, and strategic planning that many companies found valuable. More importantly, his story had become known throughout the business community. People understood that Marcus Chen was someone who could be trusted completely, but who also possessed the intelligence and determination to protect himself and others from exploitation. 6 months after David's sentencing, Marcus received a phone call that would define the next phase of his life. It was from Catherine Morrison, the prosecutor who had convicted David. Marcus, I have a proposition for you. The Attorney General's office is creating a new unit focused on investigating white-collar crime, particularly cases involving systematic fraud in the construction and development industries. We need someone who understands the business from the inside, someone who can identify the warning signs of the kind of schemes David was running. The job would involve working with our investigators to analyze complex financial arrangements, interviewing victims and witnesses, and helping prosecutors understand the technical aspects of construction and development fraud. It wouldn't make you rich, but it would give you the opportunity to use everything you learned over the past year to protect other people from predators like David. Marcus didn't hesitate. When do I start? Marcus Chen had begun this story as an architect who believed in handshake deals and treating people fairly. David Hartwell's betrayal had forced him to become something he never thought he would be, a strategist capable of systematic planning and patient execution of long-term goals. But Catherine Morrison's job offer gave Marcus the opportunity to become something even better, an architect of justice, someone who could use his hard-won knowledge of how predators operate to protect other honest people from becoming victims. The man who had lost everything to David Hartwell's calculated cruelty had found a way to turn that loss into a lifelong mission of protecting others from similar destruction. And David Hartwell, sitting in a federal prison cell, would spend the next 8 to 12 years knowing that every day he remained incarcerated was another day that Marcus Chen was using the skills David had forced him to develop to identify and stop other predators just like him. Sometimes, the most perfect revenge isn't about destroying your enemy. Sometimes, it's about becoming someone better than your enemy ever imagined you could be, and then using that transformation to ensure they can never hurt anyone else the way they hurt you. That, Marcus had learned, was what justice really looked like. 2 years after David Hartwell was sentenced to federal prison, Marcus Chen stood in front of a conference room full of small business owners, conducting a workshop on protecting yourself from partnership fraud. It was a presentation he had given dozens of times as part of his work with the Attorney General's office, but this particular audience was special. These were all people who had survived their own versions of what Marcus had experienced with David. Contractors who had been cheated by developers, architects who had been exploited by construction companies, small business owners who had been systematically defrauded by larger partners who had seemed trustworthy and legitimate. The most important lesson I learned, Marcus told the group, isn't that you should never trust anyone in business. That's not realistic, and it's not how you build meaningful professional relationships. The lesson is that trust should be earned systematically, not given automatically. Marcus had developed what he called the Trust Verification Protocol, a methodical approach to evaluating potential business partners that combined traditional due diligence with the kind of psychological and behavioral analysis that David had used for predatory purposes. When someone approaches you with what seems like an amazing opportunity, Marcus continued, ask yourself, why me? What specifically about my situation makes me the ideal partner for this person? If the answer is vague or flattering without being specific, that's your first warning sign. Marcus had learned that predators like David didn't select victims randomly. They looked for specific characteristics. Successful people who lacked experience in complex financial arrangements, individuals whose personal psychology made them vulnerable to certain types of manipulation, business owners whose assets and reputation could absorb the costs of the predator's scheme. David Hartwell chose me because I was successful enough to be worth exploiting, but trusting enough to sign contracts without adequate legal review. He chose me because my personal values, treating people fairly, honoring agreements, avoiding confrontation, made me unlikely to fight back effectively when I discovered his fraud. Marcus paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected his own experience. Every one of you was chosen for similar reasons. Predators don't target people randomly. They study potential victims and select the ones who are most vulnerable to their specific methods of exploitation. But Marcus's workshops weren't just about identifying threats. They were about empowerment, teaching honest business people how to protect themselves without becoming cynical or abandoning their fundamental values. The goal, Marcus would tell his audiences, isn't to become suspicious of everyone. The goal is to become systematically careful about the people who matter most to your business and your life. Marcus had developed a comprehensive checklist for evaluating potential partners, financial background checks that went beyond credit reports to examine actual business practices, reference calls that asked specific questions about how partnerships had ended, legal review processes that assumed every contract was designed to favor the other party until proven otherwise. But more than that, Marcus taught people how to recognize the psychological tactics that predators use to bypass logical analysis. David was a master at what psychologists call social proof, Marcus explained. He would mention other successful people who had worked with him, show me photographs from charity events where he was mingling with politicians and community leaders, drop names of projects and partnerships that sounded impressive. What I learned during my investigation was that most of those social proof indicators were carefully manufactured. David cultivated relationships with prominent people specifically so he could use those relationships to validate himself to potential victims. He chose high-profile charity events and community activities that would photograph well and create the impression of civic-mindedness and social responsibility. Marcus had discovered that this was a common pattern among sophisticated fraudsters. They invested significant time and money in building what appeared to be legitimate social and professional credentials, not because they cared about the community activities themselves, but because those credentials were tools for gaining the trust of potential victims. 6 months into his work with the Attorney General's office, Marcus had helped identify and investigate 3 other developers who were running schemes similar to David's. The patterns were remarkably consistent: identify successful but trusting partners, use legal complexity to obscure unfair arrangements, extract maximum profit while transferring maximum liability, then use litigation to silence victims when they discovered the fraud. But Marcus had also learned something encouraging: once people understood how these schemes worked, they became much more difficult to execute. Predators like David relied on their victims' ignorance of sophisticated financial and legal manipulation. When potential victims understood what to look for, the predators' advantages disappeared. The business community is actually becoming more aware of these types of schemes, Marcus told his workshop audiences. Banks are asking better questions about partnership structures. Lawyers are more alert to contract terms that disproportionately benefit one party. Insurance companies are more sophisticated about identifying potential fraud indicators. More importantly, victims were becoming more willing to speak up. Marcus's investigation of David had inspired other people to come forward with their own stories of systematic business fraud. The stigma that had once prevented victims from reporting these crimes was beginning to fade as people realized that being victimized by sophisticated fraud wasn't a sign of stupidity or weakness. It was evidence that they had encountered someone who was skilled at exploitation. But perhaps the most significant change Marcus had observed was in his own understanding of trust and human nature. David's betrayal had initially made Marcus question whether honest people could survive in a world where predators operated with such sophistication and ruthlessness. 2 years later, Marcus had a different perspective. David represented the extreme end of human dishonesty, Marcus would tell people. But for every David Hartwell, there are thousands of business people who operate with integrity, who honor their agreements, who treat their partners fairly even when they could get away with exploitation. Marcus had learned that the existence of predators didn't invalidate the possibility of trust, it just required that trust be approached more intelligently. The business world wasn't divided between saints and criminals. It was populated mostly by decent people trying to make a living honestly, with a small percentage of individuals who were willing to exploit others for personal gain. The key was learning to distinguish between the two groups before entering into relationships that could be financially or professionally destructive. On a personal level, Marcus had also discovered that his systematic pursuit of justice against David had changed him in ways that extended far beyond his professional life. He had developed a level of strategic thinking and long-term planning that served him well in all aspects of his decision-making. But more than that, he had gained a deeper appreciation for the people in his life who had proven themselves trustworthy. Sarah, his former head designer, had not only provided crucial testimony against David but had helped Marcus navigate the emotional challenges of the investigation and trial. Robert Chen, his lawyer, had worked for reduced fees to help Marcus through his financial crisis. Jennifer Walsh, the investigative journalist, had become a genuine friend who continued to cover white-collar crime stories with the same thoroughness and integrity she had brought to David's case. Marcus had even begun dating again, something he had avoided for years while building his business and then while dealing with the aftermath of David's betrayal. He had met Lisa, a teacher who worked with at-risk kids, through his volunteer work with a nonprofit that provided legal assistance to small business owners who had been victimized by fraud. Lisa understood that Marcus's experience with David had made him more cautious about trust, but she also appreciated that his caution came from wisdom rather than cynicism. Marcus had learned to verify trust without becoming paranoid, to protect himself without closing himself off from meaningful relationships. The most important thing David's betrayal taught me, Marcus reflected during a quiet moment in one of his workshops, was the difference between naivety and optimism. I had been naive about the existence of people who would systematically exploit trust for personal gain. But I learned that acknowledging the reality of predators doesn't require abandoning optimism about the fundamental decency of most people. Marcus paused, looking out at the business owners who were learning from his hard-won experience. You can be intelligently optimistic. You can trust people while also verifying that your trust is well placed. You can enter into business relationships with hope and enthusiasm while also protecting yourself from those who would exploit your good intentions. 3 years after David's sentencing, Marcus received news that brought a sense of completion to his long journey toward justice. David's wife had finalized their divorce and had cooperated with federal investigators in recovering additional assets that David had hidden in offshore accounts. The recovered funds allowed the court to increase restitution payments to David's victims. Marcus's share of the restitution wouldn't make him wealthy, but it was enough to allow him to consider starting another business, perhaps a consulting firm that helped other business owners navigate complex partnerships safely. But the money wasn't the most meaningful part of the news. The most meaningful part was learning that David's cooperation in the asset recovery had been motivated by his own desire to reduce his sentence through good behavior and assistance to the government. Even in prison, David was still calculating, still trying to manipulate the system to his advantage. But this time, his manipulation was working in favor of his victims rather than against them. Marcus realized that David would probably never truly understand the damage he had caused or feel genuine remorse for his systematic exploitation of trusting people. But that was okay. Justice didn't require the perpetrator's spiritual transformation, it just required appropriate consequences and protection for future potential victims. David Hartwell would remain in federal prison for at least 5 more years. During that time, Marcus would continue working with the Attorney General's office to identify and investigate similar schemes. He would continue conducting workshops to educate business owners about sophisticated fraud. He would continue building a life that balanced appropriate caution with meaningful trust. And every day that David remained incarcerated was another day that potential victims were protected from his particular brand of systematic cruelty. Marcus had learned that the best revenge isn't always about destroying your enemy. Sometimes, the best revenge is about making sure your enemy's methods can never be used successfully again. Sometimes, the best revenge is about transforming your own victimization into protection for others who might face similar threats. Sometimes, the best revenge is about becoming the person who could have protected you from the harm you actually experienced. Marcus Chen had become that person. And in becoming that person, he had found something more valuable than the business he had lost, more meaningful than the money David had stolen, more lasting than any satisfaction he might have felt from David's punishment. He had found his true calling. Protecting other honest people from predators who would exploit their decency for personal gain. That, Marcus understood, was what justice looked like when it was served not just cold, but with wisdom, patience, and a commitment to making sure the harm you experienced would never happen to anyone else. 5 years after David Hartwell was sentenced to federal prison, Marcus Chen received a phone call that would bring his story full circle in a way he never could have imagined. It was from David's oldest son, Michael, who was now 23 and had just graduated from college with a degree in business ethics, a choice of major that Marcus suspected wasn't coincidental. "Mr. Chen, I know this might be strange, me calling you. But I've been thinking about what my father did to you and the other people, and I wanted to apologize. I know it wasn't my fault, but he's my father, and I feel like someone from our family should acknowledge what he did." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing the unexpected call. "I also wanted to ask you something," Michael continued. "I'm starting my career in business, and I want to make sure I never become anything like my father. Would you be willing to meet with me? I'd like to learn from someone who understands how people like my father think, so I can make sure I never cause that kind of harm to anyone." Marcus agreed to meet with Michael at a coffee shop near the university where the young man was finishing his degree. When they sat down together, Marcus was struck by how much Michael looked like his father, the same sharp features, the same intelligent eyes. But there was something in Michael's demeanor that was completely different, a humility and genuine concern for others that David had never possessed. "I've read everything about the case," Michael told Marcus. "The court records, the newspaper articles, the testimony from all the victims. I've tried to understand how my father could have justified what he did, and I honestly can't comprehend it." Marcus studied the young man across from him, seeing someone who was genuinely struggling with the weight of his father's crimes. Michael hadn't chosen his father, hadn't participated in David's schemes, hadn't benefited from the money stolen from victims. But he was still carrying the psychological burden of being related to someone who had caused so much systematic harm. "Michael," Marcus said carefully, "you're not responsible for your father's choices. The fact that you're here, asking these questions, trying to understand how to be better, that tells me everything I need to know about your character. But what if it's genetic? What if there's something in me that could become like him if I'm not careful? Marcus leaned back in his chair, thinking about how to answer a question that went to the heart of human nature and moral development. Your father's problem wasn't genetic, Michael. It was philosophical. He believed that other people existed primarily to serve his interests. He convinced himself that his victims were responsible for their own victimization because they hadn't been clever enough to protect themselves from his schemes. Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. The difference between your father and ethical people isn't intelligence or business acumen. It's empathy. Your father could understand other people well enough to manipulate them, but he couldn't, or wouldn't, care about the harm his manipulation caused. The fact that you're sitting here, worried about becoming like him, proves that you have the empathy he lacked. People like your father don't worry about the harm they might cause others. They worry about getting caught. Michael was quiet for several minutes, absorbing what Marcus had said. What would you do if you were starting your career with my last name and my father's reputation? Marcus had thought about this question before Michael asked it. He had wondered what it would be like to be David's children, carrying the burden of their father's systematic cruelty while trying to build their own lives and careers. I would be completely transparent about who I am and what my father did, Marcus said. I would acknowledge the harm he caused, express genuine remorse for that harm, and then demonstrate through my actions that I'm committed to operating with the integrity he lacked. Wouldn't that hurt my career prospects? Who would want to do business with the son of someone who systematically defrauded his partners? Marcus smiled slightly. Michael, there are two types of people in the business world, those who would hold your father's crimes against you unfairly, and those who would respect your honesty about a difficult situation. The first group consists of people you don't want to do business with anyway. The second group consists of people who understand that character is demonstrated through choices, not inherited through genetics. In fact, I think your background gives you a unique opportunity. You understand how sophisticated fraud works because you've seen the aftermath up close. You understand the psychological and financial damage that predators can cause. You could become someone who helps other people identify and protect themselves from the kind of schemes your father ran. Michael's eyes lit up with interest. Like what you do with the Attorney General's office? Exactly like that. The business community needs people who understand how predators think but who are committed to using that knowledge to protect potential victims rather than exploit them. Over the next 2 hours, Marcus found himself sharing not just the practical lessons he had learned about business fraud, but the deeper insights he had gained about trust, justice, and human nature. He told Michael about the importance of building relationships slowly and verifying trust systematically. He explained how to recognize the warning signs of exploitation without becoming paranoid about every business relationship. He shared the communication skills that helped victims of fraud rebuild their confidence and professional networks. But most importantly, Marcus talked about the difference between being victimized and being defeated. Your father victimized me, Marcus told Michael. He stole my money, destroyed my business, damaged my professional reputation, and forced me to question everything I believed about trust and human decency. But he didn't defeat me, because defeat would have meant allowing his cruelty to make me cruel, his dishonesty to make me cynical, his predatory behavior to make me withdraw from meaningful relationships with other people. How did you avoid that? How did you keep his betrayal from destroying your ability to trust anyone? Marcus thought about the question, remembering the dark months when David's betrayal had made him question whether honest people were simply fools in a world designed to reward exploitation. I learned to distinguish between being careful and being cynical, Marcus said. Being careful means protecting yourself appropriately while remaining open to genuine relationships. Being cynical means assuming that everyone is dishonest until proven otherwise, which makes meaningful relationships impossible. Marcus paused, looking directly at Michael. Your father wanted me to become cynical. That would have been the completion of his victory, not just destroying my business, but destroying my ability to build trusting relationships with other people. By refusing to become cynical, by learning to be appropriately careful while remaining open to genuine partnership with ethical people, I denied him that final victory. Michael, The most important thing you can do to honor the harm your father caused isn't to feel guilty about sharing his DNA. It's to live your life in a way that demonstrates the values he rejected. Every ethical business relationship you build, every person you treat fairly when you could exploit them, every time you choose transparency over manipulation, those choices are a repudiation of everything your father represented. Michael was quiet for a long time, processing what Marcus had said. "Would you be willing to mentor me?" he asked finally. "Not officially, but just, would you be willing to answer questions when I'm facing difficult business decisions? I want to make sure I'm thinking about these situations the right way." Marcus felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of hope about the possibility that David's systematic cruelty might ultimately result in something positive. Michael represented the opportunity for the next generation to learn from David's crimes rather than repeat them. "I'd be honored to help you, Michael. But I want you to understand something important. You don't need me to validate your ethical choices. You already have better instincts about treating people fairly than your father ever possessed. Trust those instincts, verify them through careful analysis, and you'll be fine." As Marcus walked back to his office after meeting with Michael, he realized that his conversation with David's son had provided the final piece of understanding about his own journey from victim to advocate. Marcus's pursuit of justice against David hadn't just been about punishment or revenge. It had been about prevention, making sure that David's methods couldn't be used successfully against future victims, and creating resources and awareness that would protect other honest people from similar exploitation. But meeting Michael had shown Marcus something even more important. The ultimate victory over people like David wasn't just preventing them from harming others, but inspiring the next generation to actively choose the values that predators rejected. Michael could have responded to his father's crimes by becoming cynical about human nature, or by adopting his father's philosophy that other people existed primarily to be exploited. Instead, he was choosing to learn from his father's mistakes and dedicate his own career to ethical business practices. Marcus realized that this was what justice looked like in its most complete form, not just consequences for the perpetrator, but transformation that prevented similar harm in the future. Not just punishment for past crimes, but education and inspiration that would create a generation of business leaders who understood how predators operated and were committed to protecting potential victims. David Hartwell was still serving his sentence in federal prison, and would remain there for at least 3 more years. But his son was preparing for a career dedicated to the ethical business practices that David had systematically violated. The man who had tried to destroy Marcus's faith in human decency had inadvertently created someone who would spend his career protecting that faith in others. The predator who had believed that honest people were simply resources to be exploited had raised a son who was committed to proving that honest people could be both successful and protected from exploitation. That, Marcus understood, was what perfect revenge looked like, not just destroying your enemy, but transforming the consequences of their cruelty into protection and inspiration for others. Marcus Chen had learned that the coldest, most calculated, most unstoppable revenge wasn't about hatred or destruction. It was about taking everything your enemy used against you and turning it into strength that protected other people from similar harm. It was about becoming living proof that predators couldn't destroy the fundamental human capacity for trust, fairness, and mutual support. They could only make that capacity more intelligent, more resilient, and more effective at identifying and stopping future predators. David Hartwell had tried to prove that honest people were fools who deserved to be exploited. Instead, he had created the perfect example of how honest people could be both decent and strategically sophisticated, both trusting and appropriately protective, both successful and committed to preventing others from experiencing similar victimization. That was justice. That was revenge. That was victory. And that was a lesson that would outlive David Hartwell's crimes, Marcus Chen's suffering, and the specific details of their conflict. It was a lesson about the ultimate triumph of wisdom over predation, of strategic compassion over systematic cruelty, of the human capacity to transform victimization into protection for others. The perfect payback story, Marcus had learned, wasn't about getting even. It was about making sure that the harm you experienced would never happen to anyone else. As I bring this story to a close, I know many of you are wondering what happened to everyone involved in this remarkable saga of revenge, justice, and redemption. Let me give you the updates that Marcus shared with me when we last spoke, just 6 months ago. David Hartwell is currently serving the 7th year of his 12-year sentence at a federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania. According to public records, he has maintained good behavior and has been participating in business ethics courses, a requirement for his eventual parole consideration. His earliest possible release date is still more than a year away. His ex-wife, Patricia, has rebuilt her life completely. She moved across the country with their younger children, changed her surname, and now works as a victims' rights advocate for a nonprofit organization that helps families affected by white-collar crime. She has never spoken publicly about her marriage to David, but people who know her describe her as someone who has found peace and purpose in helping others navigate similar traumas. Michael Hartwell, David's oldest son, who you heard about in the final chapter, has flourished in his career. He's now working as a compliance officer for a major regional bank, where his understanding of sophisticated financial fraud makes him particularly effective at identifying potential problems before they develop. He changed his surname legally 2 years ago and has built a reputation as someone who brings both expertise and integrity to his work. More meaningfully, Michael has maintained his relationship with Marcus Chen, seeking mentorship on ethical business decisions and contributing his own insights to Marcus's workshops for small business owners. The relationship between the victim and the perpetrator's son has become a powerful example of how healing can emerge from the most. Marcus himself has continued to thrive in ways that would have seemed impossible during those dark months when his life was falling apart. His work with the Attorney General's office has expanded beyond investigating individual cases to developing statewide educational programs about business fraud prevention. He's become a nationally recognized expert on partnership fraud, regularly speaking at conferences and consulting with law enforcement agencies in other states. But perhaps more importantly, Marcus has found personal happiness. He married Lisa, the teacher I mentioned earlier, 3 years ago. They've bought a small house in a neighborhood where Marcus is designing pro bono renovations for elderly residents, a return to his original passion for creating beautiful, affordable housing that improves people's lives. Marcus has also quietly started a new architectural consulting practice, specializing in helping other small firms navigate complex partnership agreements safely. His client base consists mainly of people who have heard his story and want to work with someone who understands both the technical aspects of architecture and the business risks that can destroy successful companies. The other victims of David's schemes have had varying outcomes, as is always the case with financial crime recovery. Some, like Robert Kim, have rebuilt successfully and are thriving in new careers. Others are still struggling with the long-term consequences of David's systematic fraud. But what unites all of them is a shared commitment to making sure similar crimes don't happen to others. Several of David's former victims now volunteer with organizations that provide legal and financial counseling to small business owners, sharing their hard-won expertise about identifying and avoiding sophisticated fraud schemes. Jennifer Walsh, the investigative journalist whose articles exposed David's crimes, has continued her career covering white-collar crime and corruption. Her series on David Hartwell won several journalism awards and led to similar investigations of other developers and construction industry figures. She credits her work on Marcus's story with teaching her how to identify the patterns that distinguish isolated unethical behavior from systematic predatory schemes. Sarah Chen, Marcus's former head designer who first discovered David's material substitutions, has also found her way to a meaningful new career. She's now working for a nonprofit that designs affordable housing projects, using her expertise to ensure that low-income families have access to well-designed, safe, and beautiful homes. She often says that her experience with David's betrayal taught her the importance of verification and oversight in every aspect of construction projects. But perhaps the most remarkable outcome of this entire story is something that Marcus probably doesn't even fully appreciate. The ripple effects of his response to David's betrayal have influenced dozens of other people to approach business relationships more intelligently without becoming cynical about human nature. Marcus's workshops, his consulting practice, his work with law enforcement, and his mentoring relationships have created a network of business professionals who understand how to protect themselves from predators while maintaining their ability to build trusting partnerships with ethical people. The story of Marcus Chen and David Hartwell has become a case study that's taught in business schools, law enforcement academies, and ethics courses around the country. But it's not taught as a simple morality tale about good versus evil. It's taught as a complex example of how systematic harm can be addressed through systematic response, how personal victimization can be transformed into community protection, and how the pursuit of justice can become a foundation for meaningful social change. And that brings me to you, the people who have followed this story from beginning to end. I hope Marcus's journey has given you more than just entertainment or the satisfaction of seeing justice served. I hope it's given you practical insights about how to protect yourself from sophisticated exploitation while maintaining your ability to trust and work with ethical people. More than that, I hope Marcus's story has shown you that being victimized, whether by financial fraud, professional betrayal, or any other form of systematic harm, doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of a new chapter where you use your hard-won understanding of how predators operate to protect others from similar harm. The world needs more people like Marcus Chen, individuals who respond to cruelty not by becoming cruel themselves, but by becoming more strategically compassionate, more intelligently trusting, and more committed to creating systems and relationships that protect decent people from exploitation. If you've experienced betrayal in your own life, if you've been taken advantage of by someone you trusted, if you've ever wondered whether being honest and fair is worth the risk in a world where predators exist, Marcus's story is proof that decency and strategic thinking aren't opposites. They're partners in the most important work any of us can do, creating a world where trust is possible because trustworthy people are protected from those who would exploit their good intentions. So as we close this remarkable story of revenge, justice, and redemption, remember that the most perfect payback isn't always about destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's about making sure their methods can never be used successfully again. Sometimes it's about transforming your own victimization into protection for others. Sometimes it's about proving that predators can't destroy the fundamental human capacity for trust and mutual support, they can only make it stronger, smarter, and more effective. Marcus Chen learned that lesson the hard way. But in learning it, he created a legacy that will protect honest people for generations to come. And that, my friends, is what justice looks like when it's served not just cold, but with wisdom, patience, and an unshakable commitment to making sure the harm you experienced will never happen to anyone else. That's the perfect payback story. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of this incredible journey together. For the past 2.5 hours, you've followed Marcus Chen from the heights of professional success through the depths of devastating betrayal, and ultimately to a form of justice and redemption that was more complete and meaningful than anything he could have imagined when his world first fell apart. I hope Marcus's story has given you something valuable to take into your own life. Maybe it's practical knowledge about how to protect yourself from sophisticated fraud. Maybe it's inspiration about how to respond to betrayal with strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. Maybe it's simply the reassurance that decent people can survive and thrive even when they encounter predators who seem to hold all the advantages. But before we part ways, I want to hear from you. This channel exists because of the community we've built together, people from all over the world who believe that real stories, honestly told, can teach us things about human nature and moral courage that we can't learn anywhere else. So tell me, what did you think about Marcus's approach to seeking justice? Do you think his response was proportionate to David's crimes, or would you have handled the situation differently? Have you ever faced a situation where someone you trusted betrayed that trust systematically? How did you respond, and what did you learn from the experience? And don't forget to let me know where in the world you're watching this from. Are you in Chicago, dealing with a cold February morning? Are you in Sydney, enjoying a summer evening? Are you somewhere in between, listening to this story during your commute or your lunch break? I read every comment, and there's something beautiful about knowing that people from every corner of the globe are sharing these experiences together. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might benefit from Marcus's lessons about trust, verification, and strategic patience. Use the share button to send it to friends, family members, or colleagues who might be facing their own challenges with difficult business relationships or personal betrayals. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This channel is built on stories like Marcus's, real human experiences that teach us about courage, justice, and the complex ways that people respond to both kindness and cruelty. When you subscribe, you're joining a community of people who believe that understanding human nature in all its complexity makes us better equipped to navigate our own challenges and support others who are facing similar struggles. Thank you for spending this time with me and with Marcus Chen's remarkable story. Thank you for being part of a community that values truth, justice, and the kind of deep thinking that can transform personal tragedy into community protection. Until next time, remember, the most perfect revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about making sure they can never hurt anyone else the way they hurt you. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other. This is William, and I'll see you in the next story.